Police in Memphis, Tennessee say a woman killed her one-year-old niece while she and her boyfriend were supposed to be babysitting. We're digging into these heinous charges filed against the couple and how investigators were able to determine how the child got these brutal injuries. We'll break it down with former crime scene investigator Alina Burroughs. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Hey, so to all of you business owners out there, or those of you thinking of starting a business, let me talk to you about our amazing sponsor, Odoo. So Odoo is a free all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications that helps with the day-to-day of owning a business. So for example, I host and executive produce a popular YouTube show called Prime Crime. It's on the Law&Crime YouTube page. And say if we ever charge for Prime Crime, and no, we have no plans on doing that, so don't worry. I could seamlessly and for free build a Prime Crime website with Odoo and put a built-in checkout page on the website with very little effort. Look at how easy that was. 5 minutes later, I now have primecrime.com. So thank you to Odoo for sponsoring Sidebar, and thank you for getting me a Prime Crime website, by the way. You can build your own website now. The domain is free for the first year when you use our link odoo.com/LCSidebar. Little Kiya Moore was just 1 year old when she died last weekend. And Memphis police say she suffered horrific injuries while in the care of her babysitters, her aunt, 21-year-old Kiya Moore, and Moore's boyfriend, 34-year-old Dejon Smith. According to investigators, the two had been watching Kiya since Thursday. Around 3 a.m. on Saturday morning, Kiya was rushed to a children's hospital out in Memphis, and she went into cardiac arrest and died about an hour later. An examiner found that Kiya had a skull and neck fracture, massive bruising on her back, bleeding from her bottom. 1 year old, by the way. And that is when Moore and Smith were arrested. So to talk more about this investigation and what we could learn from this, I want to bring in Alina Burroughs, a former crime scene investigator, friend of the show. Alina, good to see you.
Good to see you.
I mean, again, wish it was under better circumstances.
Always.
Before we even get further into the injuries that Kiya sustained, in your experience, though, is it immediately obvious in a case like this that there was abuse, or can it sometimes be hard to recognize?
Especially when we're dealing with injuries this severe that coincide with what we would refer to as shaken baby syndrome. Those results can be immediate after the trauma is incurred and in the hours after. So immediate onset, 4 to 6 hours post, we would definitely be seeing some of these symptoms.
And I think the age of the child, right? So if you were dealing with a 6-year-old who had injuries and then it becomes a debate, were they fall on the playground? Were they messing around? But when you're dealing with a child who's 1 year old, I don't think it gets more defenseless than that. Then it could be more of a straightforward answer.
Exactly. And when we deal with infant death cases, these are primarily autopsy reliant cases because we lack the physical evidence that we would have with other traditional types of crime scenes, right? We don't have weapons. They're usually hands. The infants can't run or move or defend or fight. So we really rely on the autopsies in these cases to paint the picture of what happened.
From a human point of view, how tough are these cases to investigate, especially a 1 year old?
Yeah, these cases are very difficult on all of the investigators, from crime scene investigators to homicide detectives, the general public, right? Everybody hears about these cases. And like you mentioned, these are particularly helpless, defenseless part of the population. They're hard. And I wish I could say that I hadn't worked a lot of these in my life, but I've probably worked 20.
I'm sorry. I mean, I have no other way to say it. I'm really sorry these are the cases that you had to work on. I want to get into the details of this a little bit. So investigators, they went to the home in Memphis where Kiya was believed to be living with her mom, Moore's sister. But there wasn't any indication that the baby was home. It didn't appear that there was anywhere set aside for the baby to sleep. And when investigators spoke with the couple at the police station, they both reportedly waived their rights and then gave allegedly conflicting statements. So I want to look at the affidavit of complaint that was filed with the court, and it reads, quote, Moore advised that she left the residence and left Dejon Smith with Kiya. She stated that when she returned, she found Kiya Moore unresponsive. She stated that he refused to tell her what happened and told her to say that she fell asleep in bed holding Callie and she fell off the bed and hit her head on the nightstand. So, Alina, let's first start there. What do you make of that statement?
Typical. We typically see three things with infant deaths. We see the response of, I don't know what happened, I just found them like that. Or we see, I left them with fill in the blank, and when I came back, found them like this. Or they fell off of fill in the blank, right? Usually a bed, a changing table, something like that. So those are the top three stories that are given in these infant death cases. None of this is surprising.
To be clear, though, even if we accepted this as true, falling off the bed, would that have resulted in these kinds of injuries that I talked about?
Right. So one of the jobs of a crime scene investigator on a case like this is to document whatever they say in their statements that they fell off of and the distance between that and the floor. So they're taking a lot of measurements, and they're also documenting the substrate. Right? Is it a concrete floor, a tile floor? Is it carpeted? Because infants are actually a lot more resilient than we would think, and they are not going to receive the type of injuries we're seeing here, brain bleed and skull fractures from falling the typical distance of about 3 feet off of a bed or changing table.
That's a good point. And with that in mind, as I mentioned, we have conflicting stories because Smith's story, very different. According to the affidavit from Memphis police, quote, Smith advised that Moore was yelling in the back room with Callie, and he heard crying, meaning Callie was crying, and he then heard Moore slam Callie into the floor, walls, and wooden furniture 6 to 10 times. He advised that he asked her what she was doing, and she stated nothing, but Callie was crying too much and getting on her nerves. He advised that when he entered the room, Moore stopped and he observed Callie unresponsive. He stated that after attempting CPR and putting cold water on the child, Moore phoned a family member and requested that they take Callie to the hospital. And he advised that Moore stated to him that Callie fell off the bed and hit her head on the nightstand. So again, that aside the idea of falling off the bed and hitting the nightstand, that kind of excuse, this is a he said, she said. What do you make from that version of events?
I think this is where the investigation is going to turn to detectives to do their interview and try to find out. Obviously, one of these parties is not telling the truth, and we really need to find out who's responsible. But in the meantime, they've charged both of them for this reason.
And I would say, in my opinion, this other version of events, it's tough for me to say, but slamming the baby into different areas would be a recognition that the injuries were severe. And you need a good explanation for why those injuries were more severe than, the baby just fell.
Right. And I think I've heard that the sister has even come to the defense saying, that my sister would have never done this. And any of the bruising that you see on the back of the child was a result of birthmarks, which are very common. It's called dermal melanocytosis. And these are dark gray, bluish spots that are found more readily in Asian and African populations. And those are on the baby's shoulders, usually on the buttocks or the lumbar lower area. So we see someone coming to defense saying, no, those aren't even bruises. Those are just this dermal melanocytosis, which is very easily to distinguish the two upon not only just visually, but on autopsy.
And I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. I'm just curious, what can the injuries definitively prove? How much can they tell the story here about who's telling the truth, or whether any of these versions are actually accurate or both are wrong? I mean, what can the injuries actually tell us?
The injuries are going to tell us more about the events that took place and less of who was behind the injuries taking place. When we look at shaken baby syndrome, which is a brain injury, we typically see swelling, we see skull fractures, we see retinal detachment. We have some of those injuries here. The impetus for shaken baby syndrome is almost always crying, which we have already heard from one of the parties saying baby wouldn't stop crying. And then this, results as that. So they're going to look at that. They're going to see, are we talking about multiple fractures, and where are the fractures? Fractures on rib cage of a child usually indicate somebody holding them tightly or squeezing them. We might see bruising on ankles, arms, wrists that might say they were being held by that body part, and then trauma was received after that. So injuries can kind of lead us in a certain direction, but on the whole, the first thing we see is that the child has rectal bleeding. That tells us that we've got internal injury. And internal injury to organs is not always going to be a direct result of shaken baby. So I feel like we have more than that going on. And it does, in fact, to me, sound like the baby was forced against a harder object.
And just to amplify that, we have the brain bleed, a bruised kidney, high enzymes in the blood that were consistent with abdominal trauma, and blood in her lungs. Just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that just tells you the amount of injuries we're talking about, the severity of the injuries with the child. This would lead me to believe more likely that it wasn't a single incident, that there were multiple types of forceful injuries that are taking place here. The bruising of the organs and that interior bleeding, that to me would indicate a little bit more than just picking up the child and shaking them.
Yeah. And both Smith and Moore, they've been charged with aggravated child abuse and aggravated child abuse neglect and first-degree murder. And I will tell you, and this is a shocking update, we now know that Kiya Moore was actually out on bond on another aggravated child abuse case. Yeah, the details on what exactly happened, they're a little bit limited, but based on court records, Moore was arrested for a February 2022 incident where she, quote, treated a child 8 years old or younger in such a way as to inflict injury. The victim allegedly had serious bodily injuries, and she had been out on a $90,000 bond, which has now been revoked. Not a shocker there. And Smith, who reportedly has 2 young children of his own, also apparently has a lengthy criminal history in the Memphis area, because in 2022, Smith was apparently charged with aggravated assault when he fired a gun towards his child's mother during a custody exchange. The woman claims that Smith was angry that she brought her new boyfriend to Smith's home to pick up her son. So she sent her 2 young daughters to the porch to get the other child, and when Smith came out of the house, he allegedly fired 2 shots into the air, also pointing the gun at the girls in the car, demanded that they get off his property. He pled down to reckless endangerment, was sent to jail for a year. According to other court records, Smith pled guilty to assault with bodily harm in 2019, and back in 2017, he was apparently arrested for allegedly threatening a woman with a sawed-off shotgun, believing she had reported him and his girlfriend to the Department of Child Services. He's also apparently been arrested multiple times for alleged theft of property. So, Alina, when you hear about this history and these rap sheets, how does that factor into this?
We see shaken baby syndrome. The perpetrator is usually male, not always, but usually. I think we need to look at both of these individuals' background and what the commonality is that leads us to the abusive situation. So we see the female previously with abusive situations. We see the male threatening, firing guns at people. The commonality here seems to be impulse control and control on the whole. Because when you're dealing with infants, they, especially under 1, they're not going to be able to verbalize their needs. They can't say they're hungry, they're tired, they're thirsty, they cry. And when you can't control that behavior, you cannot make it stop. This sounds like 2 individuals that already have issues with control.
Look, and yes, I know I will say this from my attorney background. There are innocent until proven guilty. I get it. But obviously, given the gravity of these injuries, given the conflicting statements, there's significant evidence here, and they'll have an opportunity to fight this in court. But it seems like kind of an uphill battle. Again, what signifies to me the most is the helplessness of the child. As I cover a lot of these cases, that's what just stays with me, how young and defenseless this child was. But right now, both Smith and Moore, they're being held without bond. And a judge has told the couple that this could potentially be a death penalty case, which, given the circumstances, is not surprising. Alina Burroughs, thank you so much for coming on. Good seeing you once again.
Thank you. You too.
All right, tough case, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here on Sidebar. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. We very much appreciate it. I'm Jesse Weber. Catch you next time.